An old man from the American West, weathered, alone, standing amidst a barren land that seems long dead. A stranger, a woman carrying the wounds of her past and a hidden talent no one ever expected. They meet not because of love, but out of sheer desperation. But what happens when that very woman breathes new life into a place once buried beneath loss and sorrow? If it were you after losing everything, would you still have the courage to believe again? Would you dare to open your heart to a stranger, only to realize that this person might just be the rain that saves what's left of your life? When the painful past comes knocking, caught between loneliness and hope, will you choose to run away or stay and heal? Now imagine this one day. You meet that person, the one who makes your long silent heart beat again. What would you do? Welcome to the story of Mail-Order Bride arrives with hidden talent, saves struggling ranch a journey of faith, rebirth, and quiet love set against the windswept lands of the West. If something in these words speaks to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and join me on this emotional ride. The wind has swept across the dry lands of Crowe's Hollow Ranch, stirring up red dust that clung to the old wooden fence. The autumn sky hung pale like an old quilt, faded and tired. On the porch, Daniel Crowe sat alone in a creaking chair, a cup of cold coffee in hand, eyes fixed on the far horizon where his herd had dwindled to less than half of what it was last year. That man, once a brave cavalry soldier in the Civil War, now had only silence and the loneliness of the earth for company. The lines carved deep around his eyes weren't just from the sun and wind. They were from years of loss. 5 years ago, a flood tore through the fields and took away his only son. A year later, his wife passed from pneumonia before winter had even ended. Since then, Daniel rarely spoke more than 3 sentences to anyone. He lived, but he wasn't truly alive. On the wooden table beside him lay a folded letter. The red wax seal had faded. The words, written in dark brown ink, read, "Mail Order Bride Application, Miss Grace Whittaker, Philadelphia." Daniel read that line over and over again. 3 days ago, the postman from Coyote Ridge brought it, saying a teacher from the East was looking for a widower either to marry or simply to find a place to stay and work. He didn't need a wife. He needed someone to keep the books, teach the workers' children, and help him avoid the emptiness that came every night. Daniel set the letter down and looked out at the cracked, golden earth. An eagle soared overhead, its shadow stretching across the fence like a line dividing the living from the dead. He sighed, stood up, and walked inside. On the shelf still lay an old letter from his late wife. The ink had faded, but he knew the words by heart. If there is another life, don't let your heart turn to stone. Let someone touch it. He picked up the letter, struck a match, and watched the flame consume the paper. The ashes lifted through the window, carried off by the wind. Outside, the evening sun tilted low, turning the fields into a silver mirror reflecting the past. The next morning, Daniel rode into town. At the post office, old Amos Keller, the gray-haired clerk, chuckled when he saw him. "Never thought I'd see the day Daniel Crowe writes to a mail-order bride." Amos teased. Daniel's voice was rough, quiet. "Didn't think I would either. But sometimes you don't get to choose what you need." He sat down, borrowed a fountain pen, and wrote slowly. The handwriting was bold, steady, though a little shaky. I can't promise anything but honesty. I need someone to handle bookkeeping and manage ranch work. If you can live with the simple, dusty life of the West, I'll provide a home, food, and a fair share of profits. I ask for nothing more." When the stamp was set, he rose to leave. Outside, the wind rolled down the main street. A wagon passed by, its wheels thudding against the earth at the heartbeat of a small town, slow, lonely, but still going. That evening, Daniel returned to the ranch. The big house was hollow, filled only with the sound of creaking doors and the wind slipping through the roof gaps. He walked down the hallway and stopped before his wife's old room. The curtains still swayed. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. On the table, an old photograph, his wife and son smiling beneath an apple tree. He reached out to touch it, then pulled his hand back. Since their deaths, he'd been afraid everything he touched might break. Outside, the sun sank behind the mountains, bleeding red across the sky like an unhealed wound. He stepped onto the porch again, listening to the wind howl through the broken windmill. Its rusted blades stood still. When the wind changes, he thought, maybe it'll spin again. The words echoed like a quiet prophecy. 3 weeks later, a reply arrived. The seal read, Philadelphia, October 2nd, 1878. He opened it slowly. The handwriting was soft, neat yet firm. Dear Mr. Crowe, my name is Grace Whittaker. I used to teach mathematics and once helped my father design water systems. I don't have much to boast of, only a bit of knowledge and a pair of capable hands. I am not seeking marriage out of loneliness, but because I wish to start over. If you need someone who can work in silence, I believe I'm suited for that. I will take the train to Wyoming on the 15th of this month. Sincerely, Grace Whittaker. Daniel read it again and again, then placed the letter into a drawer. He didn't know why his heart was beating so fast. Maybe because in those words he felt something rare honesty without disguise. That afternoon, the wind picked up hard. Dust swirled into the air, howling through the roof like the sighs of old ghosts. Daniel stepped outside and looked across the vast, open land. Far away, the windmill stood silent, one broken blade leaning to the side. He stared at it for a long time and murmured, "If the wind's strong enough, maybe it'll turn again." Sunlight pierced through a crack in the clouds, glinting on the dusty roof. Tiny flecks of light danced in the air as if announcing something yet to come. Somewhere, far to the east, a stagecoach would soon set off carrying a stranger and a brand new wind. The early wind carried the scent of metal and coal smoke from the morning train. The rails trembled in rhythm, their sound echoing off the dry mountains that surrounded Coyote Ridge. Daniel Crowe stood by the platform, his hands buried deep in the pockets of an old leather coat. He wore a sun-faded gray cowboy hat, standing silent as the black train rolled slowly into the station, its smoke curling upward into a pale streak across the sky. This was the train from the east, from Philadelphia, and on that train perhaps was the woman whose brief letter he had read over and over through so many sleepless nights. When the iron wheels screeched to a halt, the hiss of steam filled the air. Doors opened, passengers stepped down, a few merchants, a young family, and, finally, Grace Whittaker. She stood still on the steps, holding tightly to a wooden suitcase. Her earth-brown dress brushed the tops of her boots. Her chestnut hair was neatly pinned, with a few loose strands dancing in the wind. She wasn't the kind of woman one would call beautiful at first glance, but there was something about her that held the eyes a calmness, touched with sorrow and quiet strength. Her gaze swept across the small station until it found him, the tall, broad-shouldered man with the steady, weathered eyes. She knew instantly this was Mr. Crowe, the man from the letter. Daniel gave a small nod. She answered with the faintest smile, just enough to soften the distance between strangers. "Mr. Crowe?" she asked, her voice low but clear, slightly hoarse from the wind. "That's right. And you must be Miss Whittaker. Please, call me Grace." "All right. Grace." They stood there in silence for a few seconds. The wind howled across the platform, sweeping dust and dry leaves around their boots. Daniel noticed the weight of her suitcase. "Let me carry that for you," he offered. "No need," she replied softly. "I'm used to carrying it." That answer made him smile a rare sight. Out west, most women expected help, but she carried independence like a quiet badge of honor. They climbed into the wagon, on the road out of town. Grace sat quietly, watching the vast landscape, bare hills, thin pines, endless fields without a soul in sight. The journey stretched nearly 30 miles, broken only by the crunch of wheels on gravel and the wind whistling through the canyon. "The land's so dry," she murmured, eyes still fixed ahead. "It hasn't rained for 2 seasons," Daniel said, "but that patch of soil there looks damp. Maybe there's water underneath." "I doubt it. The wells in this region died long ago. Sometimes the earth just waits for someone to listen." Daniel turned to her, surprised by her words. She didn't sound like the Eastern women he'd known. There was something in her, the voice of someone who had lived close to the land, who understood its stubborn patience. By the time they reached Crow's Hollow Ranch, the sun was sinking. The ranch spread wide beneath the hill's weathered fences, a windmill with one broken blade and a dry, cracked well. Grace stood on the porch, taking it all in. The sunset painted everything in red and gold, turning the desolation into something strangely beautiful, achingly so. "This is where I live," Daniel said quietly. "I think it can still live again," she answered. "You seem to believe in something I gave up a long time ago. I believe in the patience of the land. Mr. Crowe." Daniel said nothing, just nodded, and led her inside. The house was tidy but hollow. On the table sat only a few ledgers and a single oil lamp. "Your room's at the end of the hall," he said. "Supper's simple. We eat at 6. No need to rise early, but tomorrow I'll show you the work." "Yes, I understand." She set down her suitcase and removed her coat. Grace's hands were dry but steady. The last rays of sunlight streamed through the window, lighting her face, deep brown eyes, calm yet kind. Daniel realized, for the first time in years, that the house didn't feel quite as cold. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. The wind sighed through the roof whispers of the land itself. She stepped onto the porch and gazed up at the sky, thick with stars. Far away, the broken windmill stood silent, one blade drooping like a wounded arm. She touched the railing and whispered, "If the wind ever comes back, I'll help you make it turn again." The next morning, as Daniel went out to check the stables, he saw her standing by the dry well. Grace held a long metal rod, measuring the depth, jotting notes into a small notebook. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Just trying to see where the water might still be." "You know how to do that. My father worked on waterway projects. I learned a thing or two. Water's always somewhere beneath us. We just have to know how to find it." Daniel watched her, part curious, part doubtful, but said nothing. At noon, they shared bread and cold meat in silence. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting their shadows side by side on the wall. "Why come so far west?" Daniel asked at last. Wyoming isn't an easy place to live." Grace smiled faintly. "Sometimes you have to go far enough away to start over." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. He understood that feeling, leaving behind the places haunted by too many memories. By late afternoon, they worked over the ranch ledgers together. Grace quickly spotted the mismatched numbers, noting them neatly in her small, careful handwriting. Daniel saw how steady she was, calm, methodical, never complaining, never blaming, just focused. At sunset, they stood by the fence. The wind picked up again. The old windmill creaked, swaying faintly, as if trying to come back to life. "I used to think," Daniel said softly, "that if the wind were strong enough, it'd turn again." "Maybe the wind isn't stronger today," Grace replied. "Maybe you're just listening more closely." He looked at her, half wanting to say something, but only smiled instead. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be understood without words. When night fell, the light from the small house spilled through the window. Inside, Grace sat at her desk, writing quietly in her notebook. "Today, I arrived at the place where the wind still sings. Perhaps I'll learn to be like it, silent, but still alive, still listening." Outside, the windmill creaked faintly as if answering her. Morning at Crow's Hollow Ranch began with the tapping of a woodpecker and pale sunlight filtering through a thin veil of mist. The dry ground exhaled early, and the faint scent of scorched grass hung in the air. Grace Whittaker woke before dawn, carefully coaxed the oil lamp back to life, then stepped outside. She pulled on a brown cloak, wrapped an old wool scarf around her neck, and crossed the yard still glazed with white dew. Daniel was already there, trimming reins and checking the horses. The chill of the morning wind ruffled his hair. He gave her a nod in place of a greeting. Out west, folks didn't talk much. They let their actions speak. "I'll go over the ledgers this morning," Grace said. "Good. If you need anything, there's paper and pens in the stable," Daniel replied. "I have what I need, but I do have a few questions about the land." The land, Daniel raised a brow. "I want to know why the southern field was abandoned. Water doesn't reach it. The grass all died. Are you sure the water's gone? Or is the channel blocked?" Daniel paused. He remembered his father once saying there was still an underground flow there, but the flood years ago had changed everything. He looked at her small-framed, steady-eyed, and said, "You can have a look. Just don't expect miracles. I don't believe in miracles. I believe in reasons." That answer made him falter a little. It had been a long time since he'd heard anyone speak with such plain, grounded faith. By noon, under a hard sun. Grace sat in the small room with the account book open. The numbers leaned and wavered in aging ink. Debits and expenses stacked on top of each other like a brick wall. She frowned, made careful notes on a fresh page, and recalculated each line. Daniel stepped in, clothes dusty, hat in hand. "Find anything yet plenty to fix. You logged fuel costs at double last year's, but sales have dropped. Someone might be skimming. I don't have anyone here but a few hired hands. Then the problem might be in the system you trust." He sat down and stared at the pages. Grace's voice was even and clear, no blame, no scolding, just the tone of someone who had seen plenty of mistakes and still believed they could be corrected. He realized she wasn't afraid of him or of this land, and that made him both respect her and bristle. All at once. By late afternoon, Grace walked the southern fence line. The ground there was jagged, split with cracks like the hide of some old beast. She crouched, scooped a fistful of soil, and crushed it in her palm. Beneath the dry dust, tiny grains still clung with moisture. She planted a thin wooden stake, marking each spot where she suspected a seam of water below. Daniel watched from a distance. He saw her figure in the empty field, small but stubborn, as if a stray beam of light had wandered into the amber dusk. He remembered his late wife, who once sowed seed here. There was something in Grace that stirred that memory, yet it was different, steadier, less fragile. That night, supper was simple bean soup and hard bread. They sat across from each other, listening to the wind on the porch. "Did you ever think about leaving this place?" Grace asked. Daniel was quiet a long moment, then said, "No, this is my father's land. He died here. My boy died here. I can't leave it. Sometimes clinging to pain is a way to live," she answered softly, "but it makes a person forget that the earth also needs to be let go of, so it can be reborn." He looked at her, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "You think I haven't tried, I don't know. I only know the land won't revive if its keeper refuses to live on." Silence fell over the room, only the soft tap of a spoon against a bowl. Grace said nothing more, and Daniel offered no defense, but her words kept echoing in his mind deep into the night. Later, he went outside. A full moon hung over the ridge, its pale light spilling across the fields. He looked south toward the little stakes she'd planted, tiny markers, like wounds someone had flagged for healing. His voice came low and rough. "What is that girl doing to my heart? At first light." Daniel headed to the windmill. Grace was already there, a small hammer in hand, studying the broken shaft. He stepped closer to speak, but she was quicker. "I think it can be fixed. The materials aren't bad, just rusted and set at the wrong angle. You know machinery a little. My father used to say if you want to understand nature, learn how it moves. A windmill's a living thing, too. Set the joints right. It'll come back to life." Daniel didn't stop her. He stood by and watched. Grace loosened each bolt with work-worn, practiced hands. When she turned back, a rare smile flickered over her lips. Small, but warm enough, his heart seemed to miss half a beat. At noon, they rested under the porch. Daniel poured water and handed her a cup. She took it and said gently, "I don't mean to trespass in this place. I only want to understand it. I know. I'm just not used to someone touching the things I've held on to too long. Sometimes holding too tight is what makes them wither." She said it lightly, then took a drink. He looked out across the quivering dry grass and thought maybe she was right. By late afternoon, the wind rose hard. The windmill shivered, metal clinking against metal. Daniel and Grace stood watching. Suddenly, one small blade shifted. Only a single beat, but enough to draw them both into silence. It was as if the land itself had exhaled. That night, in her small room. Grace wrote, "There are people who don't need words. Their eyes carry a whole long story. Mr. Crowe is one of them. The earth here is cold, but I believe beneath this dust a current still runs." In the next room, Daniel lay awake. Wind rattled the window. He heard her voice in his memory. "The land won't revive if its keeper refuses to live on." He sat up and lit the lamp. Its small glow climbed the wall and touched the family photograph. He set his hand against it, then let go. In that moment, he felt as if someone had brushed the ash from the surface of his heart. At dawn, when Grace stepped onto the porch, Daniel was already there with 2 cups of hot coffee. He handed her one, his voice low but gentler than before. "If you need more timber to fix the windmill, I'll haul it from the shed." She looked at him and smiled. "Thank you. The wind feels different today. Maybe because you're here." They stood quietly, listening to the breeze comb through the trees. In that wind, not only was the land beginning to stir, but 2 long-closed hearts were starting to find warmth again. News about the Eastern woman who'd come to live at Crow's Hollow Ranch spread across town within days. In Coyote Ridge, where every gust of wind carried a new rumor, the story of a man like Daniel Crowe, widowed, withdrawn, taking in a mail-order bride, set tongues wagging. At the small-town saloon, a few men leaned over their beers, gossiping. Heard she used to be some kind of engineer, something to do with a dam project back east. A woman who knows numbers. That's never a good sign. Maybe she's only here for Daniel's land. Laughter cracked the smoky air, sharp and hollow. That afternoon, Sheriff Ruthie Clay, the town's female law officer, passed by and caught a few of their words. She slammed her palm on the counter. "If you've got that much time to talk, try keeping your own windmills from falling apart before you talk about someone else's." Silence fell instantly. Ruthie's eyes were firm but kind. She knew Daniel to be an honest man, and though she hadn't yet met Grace, something told her the woman wasn't what the gossip painted her to be. On her ride back, Ruthie stopped at the edge of the ranch. The fields shimmered gold under the sun, dust swirling around the fence line. She spotted a woman bent over the dry well, measuring rod in hand. Small frame, sure movements, not fragile. Ruthie nodded to herself. "That one knows what she's doing," she murmured. Meanwhile, Grace paid no mind to the rumors. She was too busy with figures and the map of water running through her thoughts. Each morning before sunrise, she walked the fences, marking spots where she sensed hidden veins below the soil. At night, she drew maps, crossed lines, made calculations. Daniel often watched from a distance. He didn't speak, just observed. Something in her focus brought him peace. He'd grown used to hearing the steady scratch of her pen whenever he passed her study door. One afternoon, Grace came to him with her notebook. "I need to talk about the western fields." "Water again?" he asked, though without his old gruffness. "Yes. I think there used to be an old channel there. If we dig it out, we might revive the flow. You sure about that? I'm never sure of anything. But I trust what the earth is telling me." Daniel looked at her. The late sunlight caught her face, her eyes bright with quiet conviction. He didn't say yes, didn't say no, only gave a slow nod. That evening, Amos Keller, the silver-haired postmaster and Daniel's longtime friend, stopped by. "Heard you've got a lady out here now," Amos teased gently. "She's helping with the books," Daniel said, his tone calm. "And maybe the windmill, too." Amos chuckled. "You're not one to let people meddle with your things. She's different, Amos. She doesn't talk much, she just works. Then you'd best keep her around. Folks like that are rare in these parts." As Amos rode away, Daniel watched him go. A quiet stirring inside, not quite hope, but something close. The next morning, Grace and Daniel rode out together to inspect the old irrigation pipes. One section was clogged with stones and sand. Grace crouched, pried each piece loose with her hands until the dirt crumbled away. When water began to trickle through just a few drops, she smiled. The brightness of it made Daniel turn aside, hiding the sudden rush of feeling. "See, I told you," she said, her voice lit with rare excitement. "Maybe you're right. I'd forgotten this place too long. Nothing truly dies, if someone still wants to save it." That afternoon, as they returned, a group of riders waited at the gate. Among them was Eli Tanner, the local banker, the man who held the ranch's debt. He glanced around with a dry laugh. "Heard you've got yourself a smart new wife." "Daniel." "She's just helping me with some things," Daniel replied evenly. "Let's hope she helps enough for you to make next month's payment. Otherwise, I might have to claim that eastern pasture." Eli's eyes flicked toward Grace, a sneer curling at the edge of his mouth. "The East may teach a lady to count, but it doesn't teach her how to live out west." Grace's reply was calm, almost gentle. "Maybe not, but water doesn't care about borders, Mr. Tanner." Eli froze, said nothing, then turned his horse and rode off. Daniel looked at her half surprised, half impressed. He realized that behind her quietness lay a strength he hadn't seen in years, the kind of strength born from being misunderstood, yet refusing to break. Later that evening, as they packed away their tools, Daniel said, "Didn't think I'd ever see Tanner lost for words." Grace smiled softly. "I don't need him to believe. I just need you to." He turned toward her. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. The wind itself seemed to stop between them. That night, Grace wrote in her notebook, "People talk about me about the past I carry. But their words are only the wind outside the door. I've learned that silence is sometimes the strongest way to protect one's faith." Outside. Daniel sat on the porch, listening to the faint scratch of her pen through the wall. He smiled to himself. Somehow, that small sound made the house feel alive again, as if it had a heartbeat. At dawn, Ruthie Clay rode up. She dismounted, removed her gloves, and said to Grace, "Heard plenty of talk, so I came to see for myself." Grace wiped her hands. "People can think what they want. I just do my part." Ruthie nodded. "If you ever need help, this town's got good folks. Don't let a few loud mouths keep you quiet." Grace smiled. "I'm not afraid of silence, Sheriff. I'm only afraid people might forget how to listen." Ruthie studied her a long moment, then grinned. "I like you. Grace Whittaker. Out here, we respect anyone who knows how to stand tall in the wind." When Ruthie rode away, Daniel stepped onto the porch, watching Grace gather her papers. "Sheriff Clay doesn't impress easy," he said. Grace's gaze drifted to the horizon. "Maybe because we both know sometimes surviving means learning how to stand alone." The evening wind rose, carrying the scent of damp earth. The windmill stirred just slightly, creaking faintly, as if the land itself had answered two souls who had chosen silence, yet refused to surrender. The October wind carried an early winter chill across Crow's Hollow Ranch. In the morning, fog draped the valley, laying a soft blur over the wooden fences and rooftops. Grace Whittaker rose early and stoked the stove. Warmth spread through the small kitchen. The crackle of firewood blended with the wind on the porch, a sound both lonely and familiar. Since arriving, she had grown used to this quiet rhythm. Daniel didn't say much, but lately he'd started leaving a few small notes each morning. "There's coffee on the table. I'm at the stables." Short, plain lines yet to Grace. They were signs of change, small, yes, but real. She brought breakfast out to the porch. Daniel was mending reins, sunlight striking the strong but tired angles of his face. She set the tray down. "It's gonna get colder. You should grab another coat. I handle the cold better than you think," Daniel said with a faint smile, a rare smile that brightened his eyes. "I don't doubt it, but even the strongest still need warmth." He looked at her, said nothing. A breeze lifted a few strands of her hair. In that hush, something warm stirred in Daniel's chest, a feeling he'd long forgotten. At noon, Grace searched the old shed for planks to repair the windmill. While clearing a corner, she found a dust-caked trunk. On the lid, carved letters M. Crowe, the name of Daniel's late wife. She meant to close it, but curiosity stilled her hand. Inside lay small keepsakes, a few faded photographs, a hand-embroidered kerchief, a framed picture whose face was covered with an old cloth. She sat down and lifted the cloth. In the frame, a blonde woman and a boy of about 10. On the back, neat, fine script, Mary and Samuel Summer, 1872. Grace's heart tightened. She hadn't meant to intrude, but the pain inside that photo was unmistakable. Heavy footsteps sounded behind her. Daniel stood in the doorway, his eyes going dark. "Who told you to touch that?" Grace startled, rising to her feet. "I'm sorry, I was only looking for materials." "That is not material." His voice was hoarse, cold. "You don't get to touch my past." The air thickened. Grace clenched her hands. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I don't need anyone's pity. It isn't pity. I just think sometimes keeping the past shut away only lets it rot." Daniel turned to go, but her words halted him for a beat. He said nothing, stepped outside, and the door slammed a blow that landed hard on both hearts. Grace sat back down and exhaled. She didn't blame him. A person has the right to guard their pain like a piece of their own body. But inside her, something gave way, a first hairline crack in stone. By late afternoon, the wind kicked up. Daniel took a horse out to the fields, working hard to outrun the image of her face from that morning. But the picture of Grace, chestnut hair, and a wash of dim light kept returning. He wondered what had angered him more, that she'd touched the past, or that she'd made it live again. When he came back, she was by the window, stitching the cloth back over the frame. Oil light fell across her face, solemn and strangely beautiful. She looked up, voice small but steady. "I've covered it again. I understand there are things one shouldn't touch without permission." Daniel nodded slightly, his voice softer. "You didn't have to." "No, I did, because I know how it feels when someone lays a hand on your pain." He studied her a long moment. In the low light, he saw a deep sadness in her eyes, familiar, though he didn't know why. That night, clouds smothered the sky, wind whistled over the roof. Daniel sat before the hearth, quiet for a long time. Then he rose, went to the table, and took up the photo. He set the cloth back, but this time, instead of covering it completely, he left half of his wife's face uncovered. He didn't know why, only that it felt lighter. In the next room, Grace wrote, "I saw the eyes of the past, and I understand why he wants no one to touch them. But in that same moment, I realized no pain truly rests if the heart that carries it is still beating." The next day, they worked as if nothing had happened. Daniel spoke less, Grace grew even quieter, but something between them shifted, not distance, exactly, but a new veil thin as mist, unmistakably there. At noon, while Grace remeasured a feeder pipe, hoofbeats sounded. Sheriff Ruthie Clay stopped by with a bundle of rations. Heard Tanner's been spreading more nonsense about you." Grace smiled faintly. "People's mouths are no different than wind. I don't chase it anymore." "Good. But don't forget, even the wind can change direction." Ruthie rode off. Grace lifted her gaze to the ridge to the windmill still standing still. One blade dipped. For a heartbeat, she saw herself reflected in the gray metal solitary, steadfast, waiting for a change in the wind. Toward dusk, Daniel stepped onto the porch and found her sitting by the well. He walked over, awkward. "I overreacted yesterday morning." Grace turned, offering a small smile. "It's all right. Everyone has something they want to keep to themselves." "Do you?" She was quiet a few seconds, then said, "Yes, but I don't keep it in a trunk. I keep it in my heart, and you're not afraid someone might stumble onto it. If that person truly sees it, then maybe I'm ready to be understood." Daniel fell silent. Her words reached the deepest place in him. He said nothing more, just sat beside her, listening to the wind skim over the dry fields. As the sun went down, gold spilled across the valley. They both looked toward the southern field, the ground still split with cracks. But here and there, the first green flecks had appeared. Grace said softly, "See, sometimes the earth will forgive, with just a little water." Daniel answered, almost a whisper, "And sometimes, with just one patient soul, another heart will open." They looked at each other, no more words needed. The last light of day gathered around them two people, each carrying their own wounds, and for a moment their pains found each other and felt less alone. That night, Daniel put the photo back in the trunk, but this time he turned the key only lightly, not tight as before. Then he blew out the lamp, leaving the ember in his chest to glow on a flame he hadn't believed he still possessed. The sky was the color of pewter all morning. Thick clouds rolled in from the hills, heavy with the promise of the first rain in months. Grace Whittaker stood by the window, a cup of hot coffee in hand. Through the rising steam, she saw the windmill in the distance still motionless, but waiting. Maybe, she thought, the wind really would change today. Daniel stepped in, wearing his old leather coat and mud-caked boots. "Looks like rain's coming," he said. Grace nodded. "I can feel the moisture in the air." Daniel smiled faintly. "You trust the land more than I do. The land's never lied to anyone," she answered. They headed out to check the southern fence line. With every step, the wind grew stronger, lifting fine dust around their boots. Daniel pulled his hat lower, while Grace kept walking straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky and earth met in a gray blur. Halfway across the field, Grace stopped, knelt, and pressed her hand to the ground. "Here," she said, "the vein's right under us. You sure, not just sure I can hear it?" Daniel listened but caught only the whistling wind. Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out a small brass tube of her own making. She drove it into the dirt, pressed her ear to the top, and smiled. "Yes, there's water down there, but it's trapped by rock. If we loosen it, it'll flow again." Daniel looked at her half skeptical, half in awe, but something in her certainty silenced any doubt. "All right," he said. "Let's try." They began to dig. The earth was hard, the shovels heavy, sweat mixing with dust. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wet air. The sky darkened. They worked in silence, only breath and the clang of metal on stone. When the blade hit solid rock, Grace dropped to her knees and began hammering with a small chisel. Daniel started to stop her, afraid she'd tire herself. But she said between breaths, "If we don't break it now, the rain will wash everything away." He froze. She was right. If the soil wasn't open when the rain came, the water would just run off and be lost. They worked together. Then the rain began slow at first, then in torrents. Mud splashed. Their hair clung wet to their faces. But Grace didn't stop. Her eyes shone bright beneath the storm, and Daniel saw in her something fierce and alive, not a ghost from his past, but someone born of wind and will. Then, suddenly, a sound like a sigh, a rush and water burst from the crack in the rock. At first a trickle, then a surge, joining the fallen rain. Grace looked up, laughing. "It's alive." Daniel stood motionless, staring as the stream wound around his boots. He reached down, scooping it into his hand, cool, clear, real. It felt like touching a lost part of his own soul. The rain poured harder. They ran for the porch, soaked to the bone. Daniel shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. Grace shivered not from cold, but from something deeper. He looked at her, voice rough. "You just did what I couldn't do for 10 years. I only helped the earth speak," she replied softly. "You're the one who finally listened." They said nothing else, just listened to the hammering rain on the tin roof. Outside, the water ran through the once dead field, carving channels, carrying away years of dust and silence. The rain didn't just wash the land, it cleansed the past. By dusk, the storm had passed. Light broke through in fiery streaks, spilling gold across the soaked valley. Daniel smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in years. "You know, Grace, I thought this place was dead. Nothing ever truly dies," she said. "It just waits for someone patient enough to bring it back." He said nothing more. The words echoed in his chest like a quiet prayer. That night, they sat by the fire, silent, the flames flickering over their faces. Grace carefully dried her field notes. Daniel poured them both hot tea. "Was there anyone waiting for you back in Philadelphia?" he asked quietly. Grace looked into the fire, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one anymore. I was engaged once. He died in the bridge collapse of 1876. They said the design flaw was mine. I couldn't prove otherwise." Daniel's gaze softened. "So you came west because out here," she said, "my past doesn't have a name." He didn't ask again. He knew the silence wasn't weakness. It was the scar of someone who'd already healed, but didn't want the wound reopened. Near midnight, Grace rose and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Daniel asked. "To see if the water's still running." He followed without a word. The moon hung high, silvering the valley. The stream shimmered, winding through the wet earth like liquid light. Grace knelt, touching it gently. "It's really alive again." Daniel's voice came low behind her. "Maybe I am too." She looked up. In the moonlight, his face worn, kind, and open seemed carved anew. And in that stillness, they both understood they had found something rarer than water, the courage to live again. A soft wind stirred. For the first time in years, the windmill turned, its rusty blades groaned to life, spinning in rhythm with the flowing stream. Daniel and Grace looked up and smiled, a real smile, complete, wordless. That night, Crow's Hollow Ranch was no longer a place of silence. It breathed again, and in that quiet house, two broken hearts began to find each other in the stillest, gentlest peace the West had ever known. The next morning, the sky was impossibly clear. The ground was still wet, but sunlight streamed down softly, glittering across small puddles. Grace Whittaker stepped onto the porch, breathing deeply, savoring the scent of damp earth. It brought back childhood memories mornings spent beside her father at survey sites. When he'd tell her the smell of rain-soaked soil, "Grace, that's the scent of hope." Now, that hope was real shimmering before her eyes. The stream they'd uncovered the night before had spread across the field, murmuring beneath the wooden fence. Cattle gathered near it, lowing contentedly. Birds had returned. Everything seemed to have woken from a long sleep. Daniel joined her on the porch, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He looked out at the running water, his voice rough with wonder. "I still can't believe it's real." Grace smiled. Sometimes the things we lose faith in are the easiest to bring back. Daniel chuckled, the lines in his face softening. "You have a habit of saying things that make a man think." "I don't mean to sound wise," she replied. "I just repeat what the land tells me." He laughed quietly, a genuine sound, light and unforced. For a moment, the years melted off his face. Grace saw it and felt a stir inside her, not quite affection, not yet love, but something deep and tender, like the warmth that comes after a long storm. All morning, they worked side by side, cleaning the stables, fixing the fence, checking the stream. Daniel said little, but his eyes followed her the way she moved with purpose, how she tilted her head when she calculated, or smiled softly when the water ran just right. Everything about her seemed to breathe life back into the land. By noon, Amos Keller arrived, leaning on his cane, cigar clamped between his teeth. He squinted at the flowing water. Merciful heavens. "Daniel, did you actually pull this off?" Daniel shook his head. "Not me." "Her." Amos turned to Grace and nodded approvingly. "You've done what no one in this town even dared to dream. You ought to be proud." Grace smiled modestly. "I only reconnected what was already there. Mr. Crowe kept it alive long enough for it to return." Amos smiled, but there was warmth in his eyes, something almost paternal. Then he said softly, "Daniel, don't let yourself miss another chance." The words hit Daniel like a slow echo. Grace lowered her gaze, pretending she hadn't heard, though her heart quickened. That afternoon, the sky turned an endless blue. Grace followed the stream, taking notes on the flow and direction, in places. The soil had slipped, she marked spots for small barriers. Daniel came along with tools, working beside her until the sun sank, turning her hair gold. When they finally stopped, they sat side by side on the bank, looking over the revived fields. The windmill turned slowly in the breeze, creaking rhythmically, no longer a cry, but a heartbeat. Grace smiled. "It sounds like a pulse." Daniel's voice was quiet. "Maybe it's the heart of the land. And you're the one who made it beat again." She turned to him. In the amber light, his eyes held something she couldn't read, something fragile, almost afraid. A long silence stretched between them, delicate as glass. Then Grace spoke. Softly, "Mr. Crowe, I'm not someone who stays easily." Daniel frowned slightly. "You're leaving? I don't know. When the water flows, maybe I should find another place still thirsty." "You think this land doesn't need you anymore?" "No. I think it can finally stand on its own." He said nothing. Deep down, he knew he didn't want her to go, but Daniel Crowe, the man who'd lost everything once, no longer dared to hold on too tightly. He feared that if he reached out again, the wind would take it all away. That evening, the wind shifted, Leaves whispered outside the porch. Grace sat by the window, writing, Daniel in the next room, his hand resting on the old photograph. He lifted it out the one of Mary and Samuel and looked at it for a long time. It no longer hurt the way it used to. He whispered, I won't let grief keep me any more. I think you'd want that. At the same time, Grace wrote in her journal, some lands are reborn, not just by water, but because someone believes they deserve to live again. Mr. Crowe doesn't know it, but he's done the same for me. That night, the lights in the ranch slowly dimmed. Outside, the windmill turned in steady rhythm, no longer a lament, but a lullaby. The next morning, Sheriff Ruthie Clay rode up, grinning, with good news. The bank's extending your loan another 6 months. That new water line raised the land's value. Tanner's got no leverage now. Daniel nodded gratefully. Grace stood beside him, her smile bright as the sun. Ruthie glanced between them, eyes twinkling. Seems Crow's Hollow isn't the only thing coming back to life. When she rode off, Grace turned to Daniel. You see, sometimes change begins with just one drop of water, Daniel replied, voice low and warm, and one person who believes it can happen. That evening, they sat by the stream, watching the cattle graze. Daniel spoke quietly. Grace, if you truly mean to leave, I won't stop you, but if you stay, I'd be grateful. Grace didn't answer right away. She watched the water flow, the wind brushing through her hair, then she said softly, eyes fixed on the horizon, I'll stay, until the wind stops singing. Daniel said nothing, just nodded, a slow, peaceful smile spreading across his face. For the first time in 10 years, the future no longer felt like an empty plain. That night, the sky was clear, filled with stars. The breeze carried the scent of earth, of water, of something warm and alive. Grace stayed up writing, one last line in her notebook. I once thought I was the one searching for water in dead lands. But maybe I was the land and he the first rain. She set down her pen and smiled faintly. Outside, the windmill turned slowly, faithfully, a quiet promise that needed no words. Late autumn brought a crisp, dry clarity to the western air. Sunlight spread over Crow's Hollow Ranch like gold silk, soft and generous. The fields had changed, no longer cracked and lifeless. Pale green shoots pushed through the soil, and the stream Grace Whittaker had unearthed now curved through the land like a silver ribbon. Daniel Crowe stood on the porch, quiet but content. He breathed in the scent of damp grass, a peace he hadn't felt in years settling deep within him. Inside, he heard light footsteps, Grace moving carefully, carrying something. When he turned, she was stepping through the doorway, holding an old violin, its varnish scratched, strings slack. I found this in the attic, she said softly, as though afraid to disturb the afternoon calm. I think it must have belonged to someone in your family. Daniel nodded slowly. It did. My wife, Mary, she used to play every evening. Grace hesitated. Would you like to hear it again? I'm not sure. It's been 10 years since I've heard that sound. Sometimes, she said, the old sounds are what heal the newest wounds. She tightened the pegs, drew the bow across the strings. The first note trembled rough but honest. Then, slowly, melody formed a simple classical tune, soft and wistful. The music drifted through the air, over the porch and across the open field, touching the fence posts and the sky beyond. Daniel stood motionless. Each note reached back into his memory to evenings when Mary had sat in this same spot, sewing under the light, smiling at him as she played. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, tears clung at the corners. When the song ended, Grace lowered the bow, her voice low. "I'm sorry if it brought back pain." Daniel shook his head, voice rough. "No, you don't understand. You just gave me back something I thought was gone forever." "Thank you, Grace." She smiled, and the late sun lit her face so that her eyes looked like amber. In that moment, Daniel understood grief wasn't the opposite of love. It was simply love that had learned to live in silence. That evening, the wind rose, the sky deepened to ink, scattered with clear stars. Daniel built a fire outside and invited Grace to join him. They sat across from each other, the glow of the embers painting their faces in gold and shadow. "Grace," he said after a long pause, "you once told me you came here to start over. Have you found what you were looking for?" She watched the firelight dance, fingers laced loosely together. "I think I've found more than that. I've found quiet." "Quiet. Yes, in the city. I kept fighting to prove I was right. Here, I only need to listen to the land, the wind, and to people. I've never known peace like this." Daniel nodded slowly. He knew that feeling, the first clean breath after years of holding pain. He poured coffee, handing her a cup. "You've made me realize something," he said. "Maybe silence isn't loneliness. Maybe it's how we finally hear what matters." Grace looked up. The firelight flickered in her eyes. "Sometimes," she said, "we just need someone willing to listen with us." A breeze passed through, stirring her hair. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, not pain, but the tender ache of gratitude. The night deepened. Crickets sang. Grace asked suddenly, "Do you believe in fate?" Daniel smiled faintly. "I used to. Then I stopped. Now I think fate's just the name we give to the people we meet at the right time." She smiled back. "Then I'm glad I lost my way to the right place." He lowered his head slightly, and for the first time in years, he felt peace, not the kind born of solitude, but of shared quiet. The next day, Grace carried the violin to the windmill. She wanted to hear how far the sound would travel. When she began to play, the notes floated upward, weaving through the turning blades, blending with the whisper of the breeze. From afar. Daniel stopped his work and listened. It sounded like a conversation, the wind answering her bow. Sheriff Ruthie Clay arrived then, dismounting her horse. Hearing the music, she smiled. If the wind could sing, it'd sound just like that. Grace didn't stop playing. She only smiled. Ruthie turned to Daniel and murmured, "You know, maybe the Lord sent her here not just to save your land, but you too." Daniel didn't answer. He just watched Grace, knowing Ruthie was right. Later, Grace hung the violin on the wall where the afternoon sun could reach it. The instrument glowed warmly, not a relic, but a sign of renewal. Daniel came up beside her. "If you'd like," he said quietly, "leave it here. This house owes you a song." Grace smiled. "I'm not leaving music, Mr. Crowe. I'm leaving something larger, the voice of the wind." That night, she wrote in her journal, "Some melodies don't need listeners, only those who can feel. Sometimes, what we awaken isn't sound at all, but the memory of faith." In the next room, Daniel sat before the fire, gazing at the wall where the violin hung. He saw Mary, he saw Samuel, and he saw Grace, three figures of love, loss, and renewal blending into one truth. Life goes on, even when it changes its shape. Outside, the wind turned the blades of the windmill. Its creak was steady and calm, the heartbeat of the ranch. The night lay quiet, carrying a single song endless, beginning nowhere, ending nowhere. Winter crept in. The western wind turned cold and dry, stripping the trees bare across Crow's Hollow Ranch. Midday sunlight no longer carried warmth, just a pale, faded gold resting over the quiet land. The stream Grace Whittaker had revived still flowed, but slower now, mirroring the silver-gray sky. Lately, Grace had noticed a weight in Daniel Crowe's demeanor. He spoke less, spent more time sitting on the porch, staring toward the dusty road that led to town. She didn't ask. She simply left a cup of coffee by his side each morning. But she could feel it, something was coming, and it wasn't the wind. That afternoon, as Grace was tidying the stables, Amos Keller rode in. His old face was drawn tight. "Grace, is Daniel home? He's out in the fields. Why, what's wrong?" Amos lowered his voice, anxious. "The bank. Tanner's changed his mind. He's not waiting until spring. He wants the eastern acres now." Grace froze, but Ruthie said the extension was approved. He found a loophole. Something about the old deed from Daniel's father, unpaid transfer taxes. He's using it to force foreclosure. The wind whistled through the yard, sharp as a knife. Grace looked toward the fields, where Daniel's figure moved faintly against the horizon. She knew he wouldn't bow easily, but that meant he'd face this fight alone, as he always had. By evening, Daniel returned, his face darkened by resolve. "You've heard," Grace nodded. "We can fight it. Let me check the papers." "No need. You mean to give up?" "No," he said. "Steady. I just won't have you dragged into it. You've done enough." His tone was calm, but his eyes told another story, one burdened and guarded. Grace stepped closer. "I'm not here to stand aside. Daniel, this land isn't just yours anymore. It's where I put my faith, too. Let me help." He stared at her a long moment. Then, quietly, "Tanner comes tomorrow." That night, the wind rose, clouds rolled in, burying the stars. Grace couldn't sleep. She opened her notebook, wrote a few lines, then stopped, listening to the creaking windmill outside its turning blades like anxious whispers in the dark. Morning came, gray and cold. Eli Tanner arrived with two men, one a lawyer, the other a surveyor, both in long black coats. He dismounted, a smirk curling his lips. "I'm here to finish the paperwork. You know how it is, law's law." Daniel met his gaze. "Law's also the tool of those who own it, and you don't." Tanner sneered. Then Grace stepped forward, a folder of papers in hand. "Not so fast." Tanner turned, scowling. "And who are you to speak legal proxy for Mr. Crowe?" she said evenly. "He signed this morning." She laid the papers on the porch table. "I reviewed the case. The unpaid tax clause applies." "Yes, but under the 1867 Homestead Amendment. If the land's productive value is restored, foreclosure is deferred by 90 days. And as you can see," she pointed toward the flowing stream, "the land is alive again." Tanner's smile faltered. "You're lecturing me on the law." Grace's tone turned icy. "No, I'm reminding you that the West isn't your hunting ground anymore." The air went still. Daniel said nothing, but pride burned in his chest. Tanner finally exhaled, tight-jawed. "Fine, 90 days. But when that's up, no clause, no woman, no trick will save you." He mounted his horse and rode off, the echo of hooves fading into the cold morning. When the dust settled, Daniel turned to her. "How did you even know about that clause?" Grace smiled faintly. "I drafted land reports in Pennsylvania once. The West borrows most of its laws from the East." Daniel studied her, half astonished, half admiring. "You made Tanner back down. No one's ever done that here." Grace's smile turned wry. "I was falsely accused once." "You learn to read every word when you've lived through that." Daniel didn't reply. He stepped onto the porch, lit a cigarette, and watched the smoke drift. Somewhere inside him, something loosened a quiet gratitude he didn't know how to name. Grace hadn't just saved his ranch, she'd saved him. That night, Sheriff Ruthie Clay arrived with a bottle of whiskey. "Girl, you shut Tanner up good. The whole town's buzzing." Grace laughed softly. "I wasn't looking for attention." "Sometimes," Ruthie said, pouring 2 glasses. "The good folks have to make noise just to keep the bad ones in check." Ruthie turned to Daniel, her gaze sharp but kind. "You're lucky." "Daniel, not everyone gets someone who believes in them like that." Daniel nodded, his voice low. "I know, and it's a debt I'll never repay." Later, the wind returned, howling softly through the eaves. Grace sat by the window, watching Daniel's shadow flicker beside the fire. He was reading perhaps one of Mary's old letters. She smiled faintly. She knew there were corners of his heart she'd never touch. But instead of pain, she felt peace, respect for the silence that connected them. Before bed, she wrote, "Today, I learned that strength doesn't come from shouting in the storm, but from standing still within it." Daniel faced Tanner not with power, but with dignity, and maybe that's why I trust him more than ever. Outside, fog rolled in, thick and pale. The wind seeped through the cracks, whispering along the beams. But inside the little wooden house, the fire burned steady and warm, 2 souls keeping watch over a land reborn, waiting together for morning light, 3 days after Tanner left. Crowe's hollow ranch seemed calmer, but only on the surface. Grace Whittaker could feel tension humming beneath the quiet, like ashes covering embers. Daniel Crowe still worked each day, but his eyes had grown distant. She knew he was worrying about something he hadn't yet found the words for. One morning, as she brought coffee to the porch, he was already there, staring toward the small levee they'd built in the fall. "I think the water's slowing," he said quietly. Grace frowned. "I'll check it. Maybe sediment's blocking the bend. If it stops flowing, Tanner will come back before the 90 days are up. Then we'll open it again," she replied simply. Daniel turned toward her. For a moment, doubt clouded his face, then softened. He didn't know where her faith came from, but her voice alone had a way of steadying him. Grace grabbed her hat, coat, and tools, and went to the creek. Kneeling down, she saw it immediately. The water was sluggish, the ground around it beginning to fissure. When she touched the soil, it quivered faintly. The earth was breathing unevenly. She ran back to the house. Daniel. "The southern bank's sinking. It's the underground channel." He didn't hesitate. Grabbing his shovel, he followed her out into the open field. The wind had picked up, and the sky darkened fast. When they reached the stream, a jagged crack nearly 10 feet long had split through the embankment. Daniel's voice dropped, hoarse. "If it gives way, the water will flood the lowlands. We'll lose everything." Grace steadied her breath. "We can fix it. I'll need fabric, stone, and linseed oil." Linseed oil. To mix with clay, it seals the wall. Trust me." He didn't question her. They raced back to gather supplies. By the time they returned, the wind was howling. They worked without pause, Grace hauling mud, Daniel stacking stones, their sweat lost to the dust and drizzle. Thunder cracked across the hills, and then the sky opened wide. Rain poured down, thick and cold. Water from the ridge surged toward them, softening the levee too quickly. Grace shouted over the roar, "We need a side trench westward." Now Daniel nodded, digging hard into the soaked earth. Mud splashed up their arms, their faces. Each swing of the shovel felt like striking the earth's heartbeat itself. A wall of soil slid near Grace's feet. She slipped, falling as the bank gave way. Grace Daniel shouted, lunging forward. He caught her wrist just as she sank, pulling her free. Both fell into the muck, gasping for breath. Still, she laughed wild and fierce. "We're not done yet." He nodded, matching her grit, and they went back to work. An hour passed under lightning and rain. Finally, the diverted stream broke through, carving a new channel westward. The flow steadied, the levee held. They collapsed side by side, soaked and trembling. When the storm eased, the last light of day broke through, revealing a faint rainbow over the ridge. Grace smiled, exhausted. "See, the earth never betrays us. It only tests us." Daniel stared at her, silent. Something deeper than gratitude welled inside him, something fragile, terrifying, and real. He reached out, took her hand, cold, calloused, alive. She didn't pull away. That evening, they sat by the fire. Daniel opened a bottle of old whiskey, the one from his wedding day. Pouring 2 glasses, he pushed one toward her. "We've earned this one." Grace lifted her glass to the land, to the wind, and to those who still believe, and, he added softly, to those brave enough to begin again. The drink burned warm through the chill. For a while, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly. Grace leaned back, her eyes reflecting the dancing light. Daniel watched her. Quietly moved her gaze deep and still as water. "Grace," he murmured. "Yes, I thought I'd live the rest of my life in silence. Then you came and made me speak again." Her voice was gentle. "I thought I'd never trust anyone again. But maybe it was your silence that taught me how." For a long while, the world around them was still just the whisper of wind and the rhythm of the fire, warm and wordless. Later that night, Daniel stepped onto the porch. The moon had broken through the clouds, silvering the whole ranch. The stream shimmered in the distance. The windmill turned slowly, patient as breath. He whispered, "Thank you, Grace, for me, and for this land." Inside. Grace heard him but didn't answer. She closed her notebook, writing one final line. "Some cracks don't signal ruin. They're where the light gets in. Today, I saw it in the earth and in the human heart. After the heavy rains, Crow's Hollow Ranch came alive for real. Grass grew thick and green up to the fence posts. The horses turned calmer, and the cattle's coats gleamed in the sun. Word began to spread through Riverton, a strange story about the eastern stream awakened by a woman who could hear the earth. The tale traveled fast, drifting through the saloons by the railroad, carried on the gossiping wind. Grace Whittaker paid little mind to the talk. She kept working as always, measuring water flow, testing soil samples, calculating irrigation lines. But she noticed Daniel was being called to town more often. He said it was bank business, but when he came back, His eyes held something troubled, unspoken. One afternoon, Sheriff Ruthie Clay arrived with a strange look. "Grace, do you know what they're saying about you in town?" "I don't go there much. Ruthie, what's happened, Tanner's been spreading rumors. Says you're no engineer, that you're a fugitive from the East." Grace froze, fingers tightening around her notebook. He found out seems someone sent him a letter. "I hear he's digging up records from Pennsylvania." Ruthie laid a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't panic. I believe you. Daniel believes you, but outsiders don't need truth to start judging." Grace's voice was quiet but steady. "Thank you, Ruthie. I've survived words harsher than wind. I just don't want Daniel dragged into this." That evening, Daniel came home early. He looked worn, heavy with thoughts. Grace waited until he sat down before asking, "Tanner came to see you." Daniel nodded. "He brought a newspaper clipping the bridge collapse, 1876. And you read it." "I did. Do you believe it?" For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then Daniel spoke, his tone calm and resolute. "I believe what I see here. A person can fool others, but not the land. The land trusts you, Grace, and so do I." Her head bowed, tears falling silently, not from fear, but from release. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to her with unguarded faith. That night, Daniel built the fire higher than usual. They sat in the flickering glow, listening to the wind hum through the door cracks. Neither spoke of Tanner, or the bridge, or the gossip. But between them, something new was forming a quiet bond of trust and understanding. The next morning, Ruthie arrived with more news. "Grace, someone from the East just got here. A lawyer says he wants to see you. His name, Benjamin Harlan. Seems like an old acquaintance." The name struck Grace still. Benjamin, once her father's colleague, the only man who knew she was innocent, and the one who'd stayed silent when she was condemned. When Ruthie left, Daniel stepped out of the doorway. "Want me to come with you?" "No," Grace said softly. "This is something I have to face alone." That afternoon, Grace rode into Riverton. The sky was gray, the wind biting, inside the small inn. Benjamin Harlan waited older now, hair silvered, eyes heavy with guilt. "Grace," he began, voice trembling, "I've no right to ask forgiveness, but I brought this," from his coat. He pulled a weathered envelope. Inside was the original blueprint of the bridge. "Your father wasn't wrong, and neither were you. The fault lay in the cheap materials Tanner forced the company to use. I stayed silent too long." Grace's voice quavered. "Why now?" "Because I heard they're calling you an imposter. I couldn't let them kill your name twice." She took the envelope with a small nod. As she stepped outside, the cold wind whipped across the street, but she felt something warm in her chest. Justice had come late, but it had come. When she returned to the ranch, Daniel was waiting by the gate. She dismounted, handed him the plans. He confessed. Tanner caused the collapse indirectly, through greed. Daniel's jaw tightened. God help him. The man never changes. Grace shook her head. "I'm not after vengeance, just the truth." Daniel's gaze softened, half admiration, half affection. "You're stronger than most men I've known." Grace smiled faintly. "I'm just tired of being afraid." That night, they brought the plans to Ruthie. She studied them carefully, then looked up. "If this goes public, Tanner loses his post, maybe even faces prison." Grace replied quietly, I don't want him to lose anything. I just want my name back and peace for this place." Ruthie nodded, promising to send the documents to the state court. The three of them sat together under lamplight, silent for a long while. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines soft, almost like a blessing. When Daniel and Grace returned home, he paused at the door. "Grace," he said quietly, "you brought justice for yourself, but you gave me something else the courage to believe again." She smiled. "I didn't do that. You opened your heart on your own." "Maybe," he said, eyes warm, "but you were the one holding the key." They stood beneath the moonlight, unmoving. Time itself seemed to stop, the wind, the earth, everything. In that suspended moment, Grace realized what she felt wasn't gratitude anymore. It was love, deep, quiet, and steady as the underground stream she had once awakened. Later, before sleep, she wrote, "They say the western wind is cruel, but I think it only tests who's strong enough to stay. And now, I know. I don't want to leave anymore." The final days of winter draped Crowe's Hollow Ranch in a blanket of fog so thick it swallowed the valley whole. The wind moaned through the old windmill, its creaking echo telling the stories of earth, of water, and of those who had finally found their faith again. Grace Whittaker woke earlier than usual. She slipped into a pale brown wool coat, lit the fire, and opened the door to a world painted white. A thin layer of snow covered everything. The stream still flowed slow, deliberate, winding through misted banks. All was calm, nearly silent, yet inside her heart, the waves still stirred. The state court in Nebraska had received Ruthie's file. Grace knew that once the truth was set free, Eli Tanner would not stay quiet for long. This peace was nothing more than the stillness before another storm. Daniel stepped out onto the porch, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in hand. He looked tired, but his smile was warm. "You didn't sleep much last night, did you?" Grace shook her head. "The wind kept me up. It doesn't sound kind anymore." "Some winds," he said softly, "exist only to test us." She looked at him as if to ask, "And what if we fail the test?" But Daniel only sipped his coffee, eyes steady. "We won't. Not you. Not this land." Something in his voice, simple, unwavering, made her believe. That afternoon, while stacking firewood, Ruthie rode in through the snow. Her coat was dusted white, her breath fogging the air. "Grace, Daniel, it's happening. The state's reopening the bridge case. Tanner's been summoned." Daniel's fist tightened. "Then it's finally over." Grace's gaze hardened. "No, Daniel, it's just beginning. When a man like Tanner's cornered, he becomes dangerous." They gathered by the fire inside. Ruthie explained that Tanner's grip on the bank was slipping, and his followers, local debtors, were stirring. He was turning fear into a weapon again. Grace's voice was calm, but her eyes burned. "He'll try to divide people." Daniel nodded, just like he did with my father. "But this time, I'm not alone." Ruthie smiled faintly. "No, you're not. The town's watching you both. If you stand strong, they'll follow." That night, snow thickened. The wind clawed at the windows, knocking like restless ghosts. Grace sat at her desk, the oil lamp flickering, her shadow stretching long across the wall. Each word she wrote was slow, deliberate, a prayer in ink. Truth never dies. It only waits for someone brave enough to speak its name. Daniel approached, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "I'm going to court with you, Grace. Whether this started with you or with me, we face it together." She looked up, eyes shimmering. "You don't have to. I want to. I'm not just protecting the land anymore. I'm protecting the one who saved it." The next morning, they set out for Riverton. The air bit cold, snow crunching beneath hooves. By the time they arrived, the whole town had gathered outside the courthouse. Tanner stood on the steps, fury etched into every line of his face. His fine coat couldn't hide his unraveling. When he saw Grace, his voice cut sharp through the air. "You don't know what you're doing. You'll bring everyone down with you." Grace met his gaze, steady. "If I fall, at least I'll fall on the side of what's right, inside." The courthouse smelled of old timber and dust. Ruthie sat beside Daniel in the audience. When Grace took the stand, the room fell silent. Her voice was calm, clear. "I didn't come here for revenge. I came to uncover what was buried. I can't bear any more silence that costs innocent lives." When the original blueprints were presented, murmurs rippled through the crowd. The numbers, the ink, the signatures all pointed to Tanner's deception. Benjamin Harlan testified next, his voice trembling but firm. Tanner's face drained of color. He shot up, shouting, "Lies all of it a setup." But Ruthie rose, her tone crisp and final. "We have the bank seals from storage. Everything matches." The room went still. Then the old judge spoke, his voice deep and measured. "Miss Grace Whittaker is hereby cleared of all charges. The court will open investigation into Mr. Eli Tanner's misconduct." Grace closed her eyes. The noise around her faded until she could hear only her own heartbeat, slow, steady, free. Daniel looked at her, pride and awe lighting his expression. He didn't speak. Instead, he placed a hand over his heart, a quiet salute. Outside, snow kept falling, soft as ash. Tanner was led away, his defiance finally crumbling. Grace stood watching the road stretch beyond the town. Daniel approached, draped his coat over her shoulders, and whispered, "You did it." She smiled through tears. "We did it." On the way home, they rode in silence. No words were needed. Between them hung a peace deeper than speech, built from trust, respect, and something beginning to resemble love. That night, they sat by the fire again. Daniel poured tea instead of whiskey this time. Outside, snow drifted softly across the dark. Grace spoke first, her voice gentle. "When I left the East, I thought I'd buried my past, but I see now you only find freedom when you face it." Daniel nodded. "You're free now, but will you stay?" She turned toward the window, where the windmill turned slowly against the pale sky. "I don't know. Maybe when the land no longer needs me. And what about me?" She met his eyes. The pause between them was long, tender. Then she smiled, quiet and certain. "I think you're part of the land, too." Daniel laughed softly, a true, peaceful laugh. Outside, the wind eased. Inside, the warmth stayed. The snow was melting. Streams trickled down from the hills, carrying the bright, living sound of renewal. Crow's Hollow Ranch shed winter's cold skin, revealing tender shoots pushing through the thawing earth. The western sky stretched wide and blue, and in the breeze, the scent of new grass felt like the land itself was breathing again. Grace Whittaker stood by the creek, her notebook in hand, but this time, she didn't write. The numbers no longer mattered. She just wanted to watch the water flow, to listen to the quiet heartbeat of the earth. After years of running from silence, She'd finally made peace with it. Silence was no longer her enemy. It had become her oldest friend, her gentlest comfort. From across the field, Daniel Crowe led a horse through the soft soil. He no longer looked like a man burdened by loss. His face was firm, calm, reborn. Stopping beside her, he smiled. "I think the land is smiling." Grace turned toward him, replying softly, "And you look happy." "I am. So happy. Sometimes I'm afraid it'll slip away like water." "True happiness doesn't slip away, Daniel. It just changes shape like water sinking into the ground." They stood side by side, gazing across the open field. Sunlight spilled like honey across the grass, and dew on the leaves shimmered like glass. In the distance, the horses moved slowly through the meadow, their steady rhythm blending with the whisper of the wind. It was peace, the kind only those who've known ruin can truly value. Sheriff Ruthie Clay rode up carrying a basket of bread and an envelope. "Grace, Daniel, I've got good news." She set the letter on the wooden table. The states declared Crowe's Hollow Ranch an official model of agricultural recovery. They're inviting you, Grace, to join the technical advisory board, and she turned to Daniel with a grin. The debt's cleared. Tanner's name won't ever darken this valley again. Daniel sat back, exhaling a laugh that sounded like a man finally remembering how to breathe. "Thank you, Ruthie. It's been a long time since I've heard good news like that." Ruthie touched his shoulder, then looked at Grace. "And you, Wind Girl, what will you do now?" Grace smiled, her gaze distant but serene. "I think I'll stay, not because I have to, but because I want to." Ruthie nodded, knowing exactly what that meant. When she left, Grace sat by the window, staring at the vast horizon. Everything ahead felt endless, but for the first time, she didn't feel the need to chase it. That evening, Daniel took a violin down from the wall. He dusted it off, tuned the strings, and placed it in front of her. This violin used to be a memory of pain. Now, I want it to speak for the present. Grace hesitated, then lifted the bow. The first notes sang out smooth, tender, full. She played the song Daniel once said Mary had loved most. The melody floated through the air, soft and steady, like wind brushing over the fields. Daniel stood quietly, listening. There was no sorrow left in the sound, only warmth, only peace. When the final note faded, he said gently, "Mary once told me that if I could ever hear this song again without pain, it would mean I'd forgiven myself." Grace set the violin down and looked at him with quiet affection. "Then today, you've done it." He nodded, eyes bright. "Because of you." Grace smiled, but in her heart something new stirred. For years, she'd been the one doing the saving soil, saving water, saving other people's memories. But now, she realized she'd been saved too, not by promises, but by the quiet presence of someone who understood loss the way she did. A week later, Grace began designing a new canal to bring water to the barren northern fields. Daniel helped survey the land, and Ruthie sent a few townsfolk to lend a hand. They worked under the soft spring sun, laughter mixing with the sound of shovels and flowing water. When the work was nearly done, Daniel paused, looking over the glittering fields. "Grace, you know, I once thought my life was over. Turns out it only began when I thought it had ended." Grace's eyes glistened. Sometimes God waits for us to let go so he can hand us something new. They shared a quiet look. No words, no need. In the fading light, they stood together, two figures in the golden field simple, real, profoundly kind. At sunset, they returned home. Daniel stopped at the porch, gazing toward the horizon where the old windmill turned slow, steady, alive. "When you came here," he said softly, "it hadn't turned in years." Grace smiled, because the wind didn't believe it could blow. Now it does. Night fell. Firelight flickered across the walls. Two shadows sitting side by side, no distance left between them. Only the tender silence of two souls who'd broken and mended in the same rhythm. Daniel handed her a small envelope, his handwriting trembling slightly. "I meant to keep this for myself, but now I want you to know." Grace unfolded the note. It read, "If one day I'm no longer here, I hope whoever reads this will remember in this place there once was a man saved by a woman who believed in the earth, in the water, and in kindness." Tears slipped down her cheek. She whispered, "You're not going anywhere. Daniel, you belong here just like I do." Outside, the wind swept gently across the meadow, carrying the sound of grass and water. The windmill turned steady as a heartbeat, the heartbeat of the land, of two souls who had found peace in each other. That spring, Crowe's Hollow Ranch didn't just recover, it became a symbol of endurance and renewal. People began calling it the Ranch of the Silent Wind, a place where silence no longer meant loneliness, but healing. Grace wrote the final entry in the notebook she had carried since her first day there. "I came west to run away, but I found myself instead. Love isn't always loud. Sometimes it comes like the wind, slow, steady, and strong enough to turn even the windmill that once stood still." She closed the notebook and smiled. Outside, Daniel tended the fire, the wind whispered under the eaves, and the sunset sky blushed pink as if the world itself was blessing them. The story, Mail-Order Bride, arrives with hidden talent. Save's struggling ranch isn't just about two lonely hearts finding each other. It's a journey of rediscovering faith after loss. It reminds us that it's never too late to begin again. No matter your age, your past, or how deep your scars may run, as long as you still believe, you can bloom once more, just like dry soil awakening after the first rain of spring. Older viewers may see a reflection of themselves in Daniel, steadfast, quiet, yet still yearning for love. Or perhaps in Grace, a woman scarred but calm, who chooses to keep believing in what's good and true. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If you saw a piece of yourself in these characters, please like, share, and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories that heal hearts and rekindle faith in life itself. Because sometimes one small story can awaken an entire part of the soul that's been asleep.